You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 109. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and thank you for joining me here this week. I hope you are having a fabulous, fabulous week. When this episode goes live, it is June 21st. And what that means is that there is still time for you to register for a program that I am offering. It is a 6-month program. It is a group coaching and mastermind program for women lawyers. I am just wrapping up with the very first ever cohort of women lawyers who have gone through this program. We are in month 6 currently. We just had a call earlier today where we were talking about sustainable growth. And I am loving the program. I love the women who are in the program. I love the sense of community, the support, the ideas that are generated, the discussions that we have. It's all incredibly amazing. I love it. I love them. I am sad that we are wrapping up because I wish we could continue on forever. But we are not. We're wrapping up at the end of June, and I'm starting another program beginning in July. And I already have a couple of women lawyers who are signed up, and I'm looking to have 8 women total. So if that sounds like something that appeals to you, then by all means, please do reach out to me. I will link to the class page in the show notes to this episode so you can learn more about it. In brief, we cover a number of topics. We talk about goal setting. We talk about self-concept. We talk about obstacles, boundaries. We talk about confidence, authority, power. We talk about time management and transitions. It is a very rich program. There's a lot of material to cover. It's quite manageable because we do it over the course of 6 months. We focus on one theme every month. We have 2 calls every month, plus a couple of extra calls to talk about time management and transitions. And what I would invite you to consider is whether this would be a program that would support you in reaching the goals that you have for yourself for the balance of the year, for the balance of 2023. So as I mentioned, there will still be time to register, assuming there's still spots open. If you're interested, I'd love to hear from you. I can always tell you more about the program, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. So with that being said, I am going to take us into today's topic, which is all about how to access sustainable motivation. And this is a topic that resonates with everyone pretty much that I've ever spoken to who sometimes has a challenge getting motivated. I think we all experience it at one point or another, professionally and also outside of work. And the purpose of today's episode is to give you some concrete tools. By the end of the episode, you will have identified strategies that are unique to you that you can harness next time you feel like you're lacking motivation. Now, the reason this can be a problem, particularly in a legal practice, is that I think we can sometimes become dependent on sources of motivation that aren't necessarily sustainable. So you might think that you want your job to be one that you feel extremely passionate about, and that the passion is what's going to sustain you and motivate you to get your work done. And that may work for a time, right? A new project comes in and you feel really strongly about it and you take a bunch of steps, you rally your team, you dive into the work that you need to do, but then you find mid-project, you start to lose steam and you kind of peter out from a motivational perspective. It can also be that you are hooked on the feeling of being really, really busy and running up against a tight deadline in order to get the motivation that you need. This has happened to me many times. I can assure you, if this happens to you, you are not alone. You're in good company. I have spoken with many lawyers who have fallen into this pattern. And it's typical in a sense. I've spoken before about the Eisenhower matrix. It's a way of sorting priorities based on urgency and importance. And typically the tasks that get pushed off the most are tasks that are important, but not urgent, right? So you can imagine having a huge brief. It's due in a month and a half. It seems like you've got forever and a day to do it, but you find yourself scrambling in the days leading up to it to get it done. And it's not because you didn't have time to do it. It's because of a lack of motivation to take steps in a more measured way so that you're not dealing with that last minute crunch. And so what we're talking about here today is going to help you figure out how you can harness your own motivation so that you can approach your work more sustainably. Now, you have very likely looked at different ways that you might solve for this challenge of motivation. You may have typed it into Google, how to get motivated at work. I did that just a few minutes ago because I was curious to see what would happen. And what I found was information such as set smaller goals for yourself, take regular breaks. Oh, I can't even read my writing, but it looks like what I said was clear distractions, keep a regular schedule, and focus on high impact tasks. So these are just a few of the bullet items that came up when I Googled how to stay motivated at work. And my guess is that you have done research on your own. My guess is that these are strategies that may already be familiar to you. These are strategies that I 100% endorse. I think these are great strategies. But the question is, are these strategies going to motivate you when you just don't feel like doing the work? Another challenge or another way that you might try to cope is that you might think that if you are truly passionate about your work, that you will just naturally want to do it. And so maybe you're trying to solve for it by trying to find work that you're more passionate about. And that might leave you feeling a little bit stuck. It may also be that you pressure yourself. You might have a habit of pressuring yourself with fear. If you know that you respond well to that, then you might find that you have a pretty intense self-talk going on where that pressure is being continually applied. And so I'm not saying that these strategies don't work. Chances are they are strategies that have managed to lead you to a certain amount of success, a certain level of success and accomplishment. In fact, my guess is that you're highly accomplished. And so you do have strategies that are working for you. But if your go-to for motivation are fear or passion, those are sources of fuel, those are sources of motivation that may simply not be sustainable. And what that can result in is that you may have fits and spurts. So you find you're really productive for a certain period of time, but then that falls away. You may find that you have time to work, but you're not capitalizing on that. Like the example that I just gave, you've got, a 45-day window to get something done, and all the work happens in the last 2.5 days. So what we want to do here is find a way to help you harness your motivation in a way that is more sustainable. So I'm going to offer you an exercise to do. So I would invite you to go along with me here. And if you're in a place where you can take notes, then by all means, write some notes down. I think you might find that really impactful. If you don't have that ability, if you're out for a walk, if you're driving, don't worry about it, but please do follow along mentally because I think you'll get so much more out of this exercise. So there's actually just a few steps. Let me see. I think there's 3 of them. Yes, there are 3 steps. Sorry, I'm referring to my notes here. And I thought breaking it into steps would be the best way to explain it, to make it clear, actionable, doable. And the first step is that we are going to rethink motivation. And what I'd invite you to think about is what fuel is motivating you. So I'm going to use an analogy of nutrition because I'm always I'm a nutrition nerd. I like looking into what sustains us, what is most health promoting. And so we're going to do that today. And when it comes to work, the fuel that might be motivating you are passion. We talked about that. Fear. We talked about that. And what we haven't yet spoken about is commitment. And you can think about commitment or love. I tend to think of the two almost interchangeably. I've talked about it on the podcast before. Last week, I talked about finding work that you love. And I think there's a real connection between your commitment and love. And the common thread there is that there's a desire to follow through. When you are committed, for example, if you have children, I have children, and sometimes being a parent is very, very challenging. And yet I feel committed to my children. I love them. It is a non-negotiable. And so to me, there's a very close correlation between commitment and love. And so when it comes to motivation as a fuel source, I think of commitment and love almost interchangeably. And I will use them interchangeably throughout the podcast. So I mentioned that these are fuel sources that can be made analogous to nutrition. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're looking to get motivated on a project and you're looking at passion as your fuel source. I would draw a parallel between passion and sugar. Sugar because it is sweet. Sugar because when you consume it, it's like all the dopamine receptors in your brain light up and it's fireworks and you're in love and this is great and happy and everything is exciting. Everything is new and fresh. It's the kind of feeling that calls to you, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't get particularly passionate when I think about carrots. I love carrots, but I don't get particularly passionate. Whereas if I think about ice cream, I kind of get that excited feeling. Ooh, we're going for ice cream tonight. Or maybe it's, I don't know, sparkling wine. You know, the idea of having a glass of champagne is kind of like you get excited about it. Whereas other fuel sources, maybe not so much. And so the trouble here is, let's say you're looking at sugar, you're looking at something sweet that's going to be your motivator. Then yes, it will give you energy. Yes, it will get you excited, but it has those peaks and valleys. And if you've got kids and you've ever taken them to a birthday party where they've consumed ice cream and they've consumed birthday cake and they've had some Coca-Cola to wash it all down, you will know that there's a peak period of high intensity energy where they're bouncing up and down in the bouncy castle. They're running around in circles. It's all crazy all of the time. And then there's a crash that follows. So if you're looking at your work and you're relying on your passion to ramp yourself up and to feel energetic, then unfortunately what can often follow is that crash. So yes, it's a fuel source. Yes, it's one that we want to harness. Yet we also want to have other tools because alone it's not sustainable. That's at one end of the spectrum then, this idea of passion as a fuel source. At the opposite end of the spectrum is fear. Now, fear, if we are to liken it to some sort of a dietary thing, I think the closest parallel to me that I could come up with is caffeine, right? This is when you wake up in the morning and you feel sluggish and you know that when you grab that cup of coffee and you drink it, you're all of a sudden going to have that buzz. I know for myself, I kind of go on and off with coffee because it just doesn't agree with me. Unfortunately, in my 40s, I love coffee, but it doesn't always love me. And so what I've noticed is that when I decide not to drink coffee, it's very hard. I find I'm very sluggish in the morning and it's so tempting to drink the coffee because I know that the minute I drink the coffee, I will feel that rush of energy, that surge of excitement. And so for you, you may have experienced that as well. You may know that when you have the coffee or you have the tea, that caffeinated beverage, it kind of just ramps things up. You'll also potentially know, depending on how you respond to it, that it can sometimes make you feel a bit jittery, a little bit anxious, that the energy is a little bit frenetic sometimes. And over the long term, sometimes caffeine can also have that similar effect to what happens with sugar. There's that drop afterwards. So you can imagine, and this used to be me during exam period at law school, coffee to get you through the exam period, to get you through now perhaps the closing, the trial, the briefs, whatever it is that you need that sustained energy for, you know that you can use that as a fuel source. However, again, it's going to be short-lived. You don't want coffee or caffeine to be your primary source of fuel. Again, it can be a really helpful supplement, but you don't want to rely on that all on its own. So another fuel source, the third fuel source that I alluded to earlier, is this idea of love or commitment as your fuel source. And that is a more sustainable fuel source, right? That is when you are approaching from a position of love, from a position of commitment. This is when you have a well-balanced diet. You have some nice vegetables. You've got a complex carb. You've got a lean protein, maybe some nice omega-3 fats thrown on top. You've got a full, substantial meal that is nutrient dense and that will sustain you. You're not going to eat that and be starving 20 minutes later. You're going to be nourished and sustained. And that is where we want you to have the majority of your motivation. So yes, this all sounds well and dandy. You're thinking, Paula, why are you talking to me about lean proteins and coffee? Now, you're probably just thinking, I'd like to go grab a cup of coffee. It's much simpler. Maybe coffee with sugar. That's the real magic. But bear with me, because where we can go with this is to use this framework, use these 3 different categories to actually identify what will be the most sustainable source of motivation for you. So step 1 was rethinking motivation and identifying these 3 categories of motivation fuel. So passion, fear, and commitment. And then the second is to start seeing what you yourself are doing in relation to each of these categories. And this is where we're going to draw from when we come to customizing your unique motivation profile. So let's go through each of these categories and think about how you're already using them to motivate yourself. What strategies you're already using, what strategies get you from inaction into action. So we're going to start with passion. And for each of these categories, we're going to go through what is positive about that particular category and what is potentially negative about each of those categories. So first, we're going to start with passion. And maybe the best thing here is for you to imagine goals that you've accomplished, goals at work, goals in your professional life, times when you've really had to dig deep and work hard to create something that you really, really wanted. Now, when you think of passion, think of something that maybe you've been very passionate about. What is it that you did to create the outcome that you are seeking? I'm going to offer a number of ideas. So for me, when I think of passion, I think of excitement, I think of energy, I think of enthusiasm. There's a real pursuit of boundless appetite, energy to do something. And that might mean casting a grand vision, right? When you're really passionate about something, you might have an idea that sparks in your mind, and then you start to imagine all the great things that could flow from that idea, the outcomes that you can create. You might then decide to invite everybody that you know to embark on this project because it's going to be amazing. You might start taking really quick action. So you might take really quick action steps. You might see that there's a number of things that will need to happen, and you might start executing on that right away. You might take really dramatic action. You might invest in something. You might sign up for something. It might be a big financial investment. It might be a big time commitment. You find yourself saying yes. And so these are all steps or strategies that you might engage in when you feel passionate. And so I would invite you to think about what your signature strategies are when you feel passionate about something. And I'm going to share my strategies because it might be helpful for you to see how I did this exercise. And when I listed out all the different strategies that I engage in when I feel passionate, the one that resonated as the strongest was actually visioning, creating a vision. So when I feel really passionate about something, I immediately have this vision in my mind's eye of what I think the outcome is going to be. And that vision is typically grand and grander, perhaps, depending. Well, certainly from where I'm starting. Although now that I'm saying it out loud, there are visions that I've had that absolutely have come true because I've made them come true. So that vision to me is a strategy that I know that I have when I'm really passionate about something, that I will cast a vision and that vision is going to motivate me to take steps forward. So that might be a similar strategy for you. Maybe it's vision. Maybe it's that you take really quick action and you get things started. It might be that you enlist a team right away and get the support you need. You get to decide based on your profile what your strongest strategy is when it comes to pursuing something that you're passionate about. Now, I mentioned we're also going to talk about the negative. So when you feel really passionate, what else is happening? And here's where I'd invite you to think about some of the strategies that maybe aren't so helpful. So here are some ideas. You may overcommit. You may see this grand vision and you decide this is amazing and you sign up for everything and every committee and next thing you know, you've got hours and hours of your life that are now dedicated to a project or projects without really thinking about how that impacts on other areas of your life. You may completely overshoot your target. So you might set yourself up for a goal that is so grand that there's no way that you're ever going to achieve it. And so you might be initially motivated, but once you start taking steps, you might feel like that goal is so far away that there's no point in even pursuing it. You might get really excited and start out in multiple different directions. And that might have the effect of diffusing or diluting the effort maybe is a better way of describing it, so that you may find you have a ton of energy and a ton of enthusiasm, but you're spread so thin, you're not getting traction in any particular direction. You might act without thinking. It may be that you need somebody else's buy-in or authorization to do something, but you're so excited, you completely overlook the fact that you need to get that authorization or you need to get that buy-in. And so now you've taken steps and somebody else is not happy about it. And so these are some examples of what might happen when you're super passionate, and these may not be all that helpful. So again, sharing my own weakest link, if you will, when it comes to passion, mine is overcommitting. So I tend to get really excited. I see the opportunities ahead of me and I commit until next thing you know, my calendar is so jam-packed. I don't know when I'm going to have time to do anything, frankly. And that's when my time management kicks in and I make things happen and or say goodbye to certain things that are no longer aligned. So for me, my strengths or my strongest strategy was visioning. The one that I need to be careful of is overcommitting. It doesn't mean that I can't commit. It doesn't mean that you can't commit. It just means that there's a strategy there that you're employing that you need to be careful about. So that covers passion. Now we're going to move on to fear and do exactly the same exercise. So what's positive? What could possibly be positive about fear? If you've listened to this podcast in the past, you may have listened to the podcast episode that I have. It's from a while ago, and it's all about how to leverage stress. And the name is currently escaping me. I talk about Kelly McGonigal and her work regarding the upside of stress. So stress, when you look at it as helpful, can actually be really helpful. The way that you perceive stress actually changes the way that your body processes stress. It's quite neat. That is for another podcast episode. But the takeaway here is that stress can be helpful. Fear can be helpful. The reason that the deadline is so impactful is because it moves you into action. So what are some of the positives that come with fear? Well, absolutely. Like I just said, it moves you from inaction to action. So that 45-day deadline that you had for doing that paper, it puts you into action. If there was no deadline, perhaps it would just continue to drift beyond that 45 days. So it moves you to action. It also helps with focus when you have an immediate task in mind, when perhaps you're in that fight, flight, or freeze state of mind. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. You focus on what you need to do to survive. And so you're able to focus on the task at hand. You may find that you reach a point where you will do something, anything to move forward. So you might find you're taking more courageous action. You're taking more bold action, actions that you might talk yourself out of if it weren't for the pressure. And it may also be that you find that you're able to pare things down. When we have a limited amount of time, when we're feeling stressed or when we feel fearful, sometimes that can help us identify what the key things are that need to get done. And then we can jump in and execute and get those things done. So when it comes to stress or fear, I would invite you to think about what your top strategies are. What is effective for you when you feel fear in relation to a project? When you're motivated by fear, what are some of the strategies that you engage in? And let's pick your top strategy. My top strategy, I mentioned that I would share mine, is to simplify. That is probably the most effective strategy that I have when I feel like the pressure is on. I like to simplify what is being done. I have other strategies as well that I find can be effective, but that probably is the top one. Focus, I think, would be the second top. Now, let's also think about what some of the negative consequences can be if we're relying on fear as a motivator. So what happens when you're really scared? Well, sometimes I mentioned the fight, flight, or freeze response. You might simply freeze. You may avoid a task altogether because you feel fearful of it. You might rush through that task in a hurry, and you might skip or miss important steps in the process. You might be moving so quickly that you make mistakes. You may also not plan all that efficiently. So if you're really, really focused and you're laser focused on a particular part of the task, you may overlook that there's an easier way to do it. You may overlook that there's a way of doing it in a fashion where you can take advantage of time. One example that comes to mind for me would be, and I love cooking examples, so I'm going to use this, but let's say you're making a meal and you have a roast beef, you have steamed green beans, and you have rice, maybe a salad. You're going to want to strategize or structure your meal planning so that the roast goes in 2 hours ahead. Then you have the rice that goes on 30 minutes ahead. The beans can go on 15 minutes ahead, and the salad you can throw together in the last 5 minutes. You're taking advantage of that 2-hour framework to let the oven do the work when it comes to your cooking. Now, you may not know this about me already, but as a working mom who is regularly responsible for meals on work days, I rely on my oven to get a lot of meals done for that reason, because I can put something in the oven and I don't have to think about it. Chicken works really well, by the way. I'm completely digressing, but bringing it back into focus, what does that mean for professional work? Well, that might mean that if you've got a big project, you can start delegating pieces of that project out to other people. You don't necessarily need to do that work yourself. It might also mean that there are pieces of the project. Maybe it's an affidavit that's getting sworn by somebody who lives overseas and you need the original before you can file it for court. You want to get that process started early. It might be that there's an approval that you need and you know that there's a 3-week turnaround for that to happen. You want to get that started early. So when it comes to this idea of relying on fear as a motivator, sometimes if you're so focused in on the narrow detail, so focused in on the execution part, you might miss out on the opportunity to leverage time. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that myopic, right? It can be helpful because it's focusing you, but it might also help you or hinder you from fully taking advantage of your resources in completing a particular project. Other potential negative things, strategies that you might engage in, you might try to do it all by yourself. You might try to do it all at once. And you may find that you isolate yourself, that you get really frustrated, concerned, anxious. And so you literally shut the door and put your head down and get to work. And it may be that there's opportunities there for you to enlist the help of other people. So think about what strategies you are engaging in when you feel motivated by fear. Yes, I apologize for the chicken distraction, but maybe one of you perhaps lovingly picked up some ideas. Maybe you can relate to my dinner making struggles. Anyhow, I offered that I would share my weakest strategy. My weakest strategy when it comes to fear is not seeing the forest from the trees. So that to me is probably where I lose out on opportunities because I'm so focused in the execution that I don't always take a step back to see where it fits into the big picture. And I think that by taking that step back and seeing where things fit in the big picture, I may be able to recalibrate my strategy or my list of my plan, how I'm approaching things to be more effective. So again, I invite you to think about what resonates with you because ultimately this is your list. So we've covered passion, we've covered fear, and that leaves the last fuel source, the most sustainable fuel source, which of course is love and commitment. So for love and commitment, we can probably think a lot of positive strategies that emanate from that feeling. I'm going to offer some of them. I'm going to start with commitment. So commitment until the end. When you truly love something, someone, there is a commitment there to follow through until the end. And sometimes it is commitment that is going to carry the day. It's not necessarily going to be love. I mentioned in my podcast the other week that the definition of love often connotes this idea of affection. And sometimes you may feel absolutely no affection for the third time that you're reviewing the affidavit. You're not feeling affection for the fact that you're at the office. It's 11 o'clock and you're still waiting for that last document that you need before you can go home. You may not feel affection. However, you may be able to tap into commitment. So if you're looking at love and commitment as a fuel source, you may be able to borrow on some of that strategy, that commitment, to make you feel more motivated. You may employ as a strategy problem solving with the resolution in mind. So you might imagine if you are experiencing the opposite of love, where there's no commitment, you aren't going to concern yourself so much with the relationship that's involved there. You're not going to concern yourself so much with what is the bigger picture. You might just take actions because you want to without necessarily weighing the larger picture. When commitment and love are the driving forces, chances are you're looking at everybody involved in that equation. You're looking at the outcome and wanting it to resolve in a way that is most agreeable to the most stakeholders who are involved. When you feel love, you may find that you're in that rest and digest state of mind, which physiologically allows you to access greater creativity. And so you may find that you're thinking more creatively in terms of the solutions that you can offer. You may find that your feelings of love and commitment actually motivate you to take more care in the process. You might take a great deal of care because you love the work. You may really love the craft. You may love the excellence, the way that you perform or execute your work. You may find that when you're motivated by commitment, you take the time to plan and execute in a way that feels calm and measured and grounded. And so these are some suggestions, and these are the suggestions that I offer. You will have your own suggestions in terms of the strategies that you find yourself engaging in when you feel like you are motivated by love, by commitment. And the top strategy that I identified for myself when I am truly feeling committed, when I truly feel a sense of love for something that I am working on, my go-to strategy is to plan, execute, and follow through. That to me is a strength of mine when I feel love and commitment toward a project. And you can see how that is a very sustainable way of proceeding. And so you might ask yourself what it is that is applicable to you. What strategy resonates for you when it comes to love? Now, even with love, there can be negative strategies that you may be engaging in. And the image that comes to mind here for me is the notional image of the doting grandparents. You know, the grandparents who love their grandchildren and they're just dying for the opportunity for them to squeeze them and hug them and take sugary treats out of their pocket and feed them all the sugar and offer them all of the things and, indulge in every single possible way, right? There's this idea of it emanating from this sense of love. And when you think about your practice, you might ask yourself if there are ways in which you are showing up with maybe more love or love expressed in a way that is no longer particularly productive when you look at the objective that you have for your work. So what are some of the strategies that you may be engaging in unconsciously that are not necessarily helping you? Well, one of them may be to smother. You might find that you're so committed to a project that you're kind of smothering it to the detriment potentially of the project itself, potentially to the detriment of other aspects of your life. You may find that you are so committed to the project succeeding that you try to control everything. You hang on really tightly. You might find that you micromanage. You're not willing to let things go. That might be a strategy that in some ways you feel like it's coming from a place of love. However, you need to ask yourself if it is the most effective strategy. Similarly, you might find that you're hanging on too tightly to a particular project. You may actually overlook problems. Maybe you're in that state where, they say it's a face that only a mother could love. It's a terrible expression, but it may be a project that only a mother could love, right? You might be in a project and there are holes in the project. There are problems. There are things that you may see but choose not to see because you love the project so much. So instead of addressing some of the shortcomings, you might simply gloss over them because you're so committed. So it comes from a place of love, but the potential consequences can be negative. You may also find that you're not willing to let go. Sometimes a project may be one that is in need of abandonment. Maybe it just needs to be let go. It's no longer fruitful. It's not turning out the way it's supposed to, and it cannot be salvaged. And yet you're so attached to it that you find you're not able to let it go. So these are some ways that love can actually be counterproductive when it comes to achieving your goals. And so what I'd invite you to consider is which of these strategies resonates with you. And I will share with you that the one that resonates most strongly with me is that over control. When I really love something, I try so hard to control it, and it doesn't always leave room for the magic. It doesn't leave room for me to delegate and get other people involved in the project. It doesn't necessarily leave room for it to go a different way. So these are the strategies now that we've identified that you may be able to leverage when it comes to motivation, which leads us to step 3 is to summarize and apply what you have just learned about yourself. So going back, we talked about the 3 different categories: passion, fear, and love. And we identified for each of those categories a positive strategy, a productive strategy that you already know works for you. So we talked about, in my case, love was the ability to plan, execute, and follow through. That is my most sustainable strategy. So I want most of my strategy to come from that place of love. Again, turning to that idea of you're stuck, you need motivation. We're going to turn first to sustainable love commitment. So if you've got that project, look at your strategy. In my case, it's that ability to plan, execute, and follow through. Can I take the project ahead of me if I'm not feeling motivated and use that strategy, planning, executing, and follow through to get it done? I would invite you to do the same. Now, if that doesn't work, if that's not a strategy that's going to help you cross the threshold from inaction to action, then I'd invite you to think about what strategy would be effective if you felt more passionate about the project that you're working on. So for me, the strategy is vision. So if I'm not able to plan my way out of a problem, can I create a vision that is exciting enough, that generates enough passion for me that I can then get motivated into taking action toward the goal? And for you, I would invite you to consider, can you do the same thing? Is there a way for you to take that strategy, your passion, your top passion strategy, and use that strategy to help you cross that threshold and move into action? And if that doesn't work, then we turn to fear. And what is it that might be really helpful for you to bring you into action? And for me, it is simplify. For you, it will be a different strategy. But if you're not able to get through your most sustainable strategy, then you move into visioning and then simplify, right? What is it that you would do if you were feeling that fear? You would simplify the project or whatever strategy works for you. And so now you've got a formula. So what I recommend doing is almost having, if you want to do this, is having like a cue card. And on the left-hand side, you have a column. Here are your top 3 strategies, right? It's the committed strategy, it's the passion strategy, it's the fear strategy. So for me, that's plan, vision, simplify. We're also going to want to pay some attention to the strategies that you identified as your weakest strategies. And so the 3 to watch for, these are 3 strategies you're going to want to watch for. So number 1 is to look for a tendency perhaps to control, in my case. So what was the sort of the shadow side, the negative potential strategy when it came to love? For me, it was control. So what is that for you? You're going to want to keep an eye on that you may try to over control things and that this might slow you down. The second was, what was the passion strategy, right? If you're looking at something that might slow you down, in my case, it was overcommitting. Are you doing something similar? And then finally, fear. What is it that might potentially be holding you back when you think of fear? And so for me, that was losing sight of what is most important. And so that's something that I need to be aware of. If I'm feeling a lack of motivation, I might look to that and say, okay, well, is this task ahead of me, is it actually really important? Or have I managed to weave myself into a situation where I am executing on tasks that in the grand scheme are not that important? So to summarize, what we have just done is we've done effectively 3 steps. First of all, we identified that there's 3 different fuel sources when it comes to motivation: love, fear, and passion. We looked at the strategies that you use in relation to each of those different fuel sources, and we identified positive strategies, we identified negative strategies, and then finally, we took the key ones, the top 6, the top 3 winning strategies, the top 3 defeating strategies, and now you have them. You can rely on those winning strategies when you need them, and you know to be watchful for those strategies that you know can hold you back. Now, the reason that this will work as a sustainable source of motivation is that you now have more control over your access to motivation. You've got a channel that you can go through, a framework that you can use, and specific strategies that you can engage. And these strategies are ones that are winning strategies for you. If you've gone through this exercise and you've answered these questions for yourself, you have previous experience that tells you that these are strategies that you can use. They will help you succeed. Another reason this will be helpful is if you can start developing more sustainable motivation, then what you can do is reduce any feast or famine cycles that you might be currently experiencing. And what you might find is that if you're in a famine cycle, for example, where you're not being very productive, the work starts to pile up, then when you finally do get motivated, there's a mountain of work for you to do. It's a little bit like if you skip your cleanings at the dentist over the course of time. When you finally do go in, it's a 2-hour appointment instead of a 45-minute cleaning. You want to avoid that. And so when you start being more consistent with your motivational hygiene, we can call it, you'll be overall more effective. And so it'll be less painful to get started because you're not starting from scratch. You will find that you are able to proactively use your time in a way that is more efficient. And finally, the reason that this is going to work is that it will become a habit. If you do this repeatedly, you no longer have to really consciously tap in so much to your motivation, but you'll find because you're in the habit of doing, you're in the habit of transferring yourself from inaction to action, it becomes more natural. And what you might think about is if you've got habits already, I like to exercise first thing in the morning. I don't even think about it. I don't rely on motivation to do it. The idea here is to use motivation until it becomes a habit, and then you no longer need to rely so much on your motivation. The skills that you'll need to use to develop this skill to enhance your access to sustainable motivation is self-awareness. I encourage you to go through these exercises to think about really for you what strategies work and what does not work. You will need to manage your expectations. Again, going back to this idea that your work is always going to be passionate. You're going to feel passionate about it. It's going to be exciting. It's not always going to be exciting. And so what else can you rely on when your work just isn't that sweet ice cream cone desirable thing to do, that it's more of a carrot or some, I don't know, whatever is plain and uninteresting to you, but needs to get done and is nourishing. And then finally, you'll need to repeat. If you commit to the process, you do this multiple times, then you will eventually develop that habit. And so it does require some level of commitment and repetition on your part. And what will happen as a result is that you will be able to generate for yourself sustainable motivation. You won't need to depend so much on deadlines. You won't need to depend so much on excitement because something is brand new. You'll be able to generate that motivation for yourself and move yourself into action. You will know how to motivate yourself even when, and especially when you simply do not feel like doing it. And finally, you now have strategies that are uniquely customized to you. So you can revisit this exercise whenever you need to, because you will change. Your strategies may also change. So you might find that your strategies evolve as your practice evolves. And you can do this exercise continually and revisit and redecide what your strategies are going to be. And so this is a tool that grows with you. So, my dear friend, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you now feel motivated and that you have greater awareness of how you can tap into your own motivation. As I mentioned, my group program will be starting in July. If you're interested, then please do let me know. I would love to have you in the group. And just wanted to say a big thank you for joining me here this week. I look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. Take care. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.